It's the week ending Saturday, the 1st of June, and this is the Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen the Conservative leadership contest getting underway, the Brexit Party winning the most seats in the UK's EU elections, and Chelsea winning the Europa League. But we're here to bring you some stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news, not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Olly Mann. Let's unwrap the week. And joining me today from the week's digital team are Jamie Timson, Kari, Wilkin and Arion McNicoll. And Arion, you get to start the show this week. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
This week we discovered that we're spending too much time in the great indoors.
It's doubled in the past 10 decades. It's a bone disease caused by vitamin D deficiency. And what happens, that causes the bones to be weak, to be softened, to bend, to be deformed.
And this is in children?
Yeah, this is increasing in children. Well, why? The specialists tell us it's due to the kids being indoors, they're spending an extra hour indoors now than they were 5 years ago. Your body gets most of its vitamin D from the sunshine, and your skin is the vitamin D factory. It's in the diet as well, but the skin's the main source with sunlight.
Dr. Chris Steele, speaking to ITV's This Morning on Tuesday. Feels weird using his surname. Arion, Dr. Chris explained it all there, but I want to hear it in your Antipodean tones, please. What's the story?
The story is about vitamin D, instant Antipodean tones there.
Done immediately.
So Dr. Chris was explaining that we're not getting enough vitamin D and we need to start taking supplements. It seems that there's been a bit of a sort of pincer movement of scientists saying the same thing this week, because simultaneously Steve Jones, one of Britain's leading geneticists, appeared at the Hay Festival and said the exact same thing. He used to be sceptical about taking all sorts of vitamin supplements, but actually he now realises that we all need to do it, and particularly vitamin D, because we're all spending way too much time indoors.
Oh, is that where this story came from? I'm immediately less interested now, because I thought, God, there's a scientific consensus on vitamin D. But, Hay Festival, I mean, they're just desperate for news lines out of that, aren't they? It's a bloke giving a speech in a tent, basically.
Well, the truth is that actually there has been a pronounced rise in rickets. So we thought that we'd eradicated this bone softening condition, particularly affects children, around the 1950s. But now there's been this steady rise, and these days you've got about 450 cases being diagnosed each year. So there is actually something going on scientifically here.
But Kari, this was reported, wasn't it, by one newspaper at least, as a kind of rickets epidemic. Is it?
No, I don't think you can say that 450 kids a year is an epidemic, but it's clearly something to be worried about. There are many other effects of our indoor lifestyles. There's a really interesting article by Vibar Cregan-Reid, who's the author of Primate Change, How the World We Made is Remaking Us, all about basically how our lifestyles are changing our actual physiologies. And he talks about, I had no idea, but there's actually been a number of infant deaths caused by vitamin D deficiency in Britain in recent years. I found that astounding. So, clearly this is something very serious. A study published in 2001 in the US found that the average American spent 93% of their time indoors, and that's only going to have got worse in this era of, tablets and smartphones.
And not only do people spend too much time indoors, but they don't realise they're doing it. And that was a finding of a separate study by YouGov that spoke to 16,000 people across 14 countries in Northern America and Europe, which asked people to report on the amount of time they thought that they were spending indoors. Most people thought that they were spending still long periods, up to 2/3 of their day inside, but actually, as Kari says, the actual figure is closer to about 90% in most parts of the world.
I think people are stupid. How can they not realise when they're not indoors? That's ridiculous.
Yeah, but they sort of flatteringly depict...
They just lie in these surveys, basically.
No, they probably I think they genuinely, they look back on their day and they think, no, I'm not the kind of person who stays indoors that much.
Possibly they're overestimating, their commute. Oh, well, I was outside, I walked to work. And you're not thinking about that in terms of your overall day. That's
when they see the sun,
percentage.
It just goes, whoa, blinds them. So they're very, that fixes their mind,
And
I
also, I think we're not looking at the overall averages. In the past 200 years, we've gone from 90% of people working outdoors to less than 20%. So that's going to have had a huge effect on the overall average, which perhaps we're not taking into account.
But it's all fixable. right? So if we just take more vitamins, if we just take more vitamin D supplements, then we are okay again?
It's not just vitamin D. I mean, there was a study in Singapore where there's virtually no houses with gardens, and they found that myopia, as in short-sightedness, affects 85% of young people, but only 30% of the older generation. So this isn't just inherited. And to grow to an optimum shape, a developing eye needs exposure to good quality light, for example. This is just one effect, but you're not going to get that from a vitamin D supplement. We need to get outdoors.
Well, Jamie, you are the youngest person in the room.
Yes, by some way.
Have you felt your health suffer in comparison to your ancient peers here?
I do look at you guys particularly as a kind of a beacon of health. And, well, like, it's all those things about, I think, more air pollution. I always think that's mad. Like, I think having grown up in, zone 2 of London for my entire life, and all of those things that people try and make you do, like eating healthily and stuff, and then eventually what it'll be is they'll look in my lungs and just be like, oh my god, he's just been inhaling an exhaust.
Contrary to that, unfortunately, according to something else I read, the average adult breathes 18,000 litres of air a day. And one of the great problems that we don't realise is that indoor air is as bad often as outdoor air and as toxic.
Yeah, this was in the news recently, wasn't it, in recent weeks, about how the effects of like frying food, for example, can be horrific.
Plus mould, damp, even sort of toxic cleaning products that we use to clean indoor spaces. So we kind of think of air pollution as being something that we encounter outside. But again, it's another problem with spending too much time indoors.
Don't take Jamie Timpson's bone here. We're talking about light. We're not talking about air pollution. He's just distracted us onto the contents of his lungs. This is about how much time we spend outdoors.
We're just trying to have a good chat, mate.
And
let us just have a good chat.
A lot of the reason why I think this story has trended is because it plays into a narrative, doesn't it, that particularly kids and teenagers don't spend enough time outdoors because, Mail Online says they spend too much time looking at their smartphones and tablets and stuff. But we know that you can use those devices outdoors as well. I mean, increasingly so.
Yes, and I think it's important to look at those statistics that show that this problem existed in the 90s. We were not getting enough sunlight back in the 90s, so it's not something to do with tablets and video games.
It's been exacerbated by that.
So I think that kids are spending yet more time inside potentially, but that's not the problem.
It's 2,000 years worth of anthropology, isn't it?
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah.
And also the Victorians, during the Victorian age, everyone was inside. Like, it's a bit of a myth that the further you go back, the more that people were outside. There were people inside working all the day. It's like, yeah, what do we want kids to be? Do we want them to be under the factory floor, getting their fingers chopped off? Do we want them to be inside playing with the smartphone? Do we want them to be in this heyday, this golden heyday of the 50s and 60s where people were able to be outside? But inevitably, paedophiles existed, so they were out there at the same time. There was no good time to have children outside. I don't see this as being such a bad thing.
I mean, it's difficult to know where to start, isn't it, really? I mean, if you're worried about air pollution, I mean, the Victorian era, I think, was pretty strong for that too.
Yeah.
Arion, this is your story. Where do you think we'll be in 10 years' time?
Probably still in a very similar place in terms of the amount of time that we're spending inside. So I think it is probably important this time, actually, to heed two doctors' advice on this and take vitamin D supplements. If you're not going to get sunlight
Well, get sunlight. I mean, that's the more important thing.
There are global
if you're in Scotland,
Yes, well, no, you've made a serious point. I wasn't expecting that.
Yeah.
Yes, people in Scotland
average of 30 hours a month less sun than England.
Yeah, and there's not
year.
much they can do about that.
Well, no, they can move out of Scotland, I guess.
Yeah, but if you're listening in Scotland, you should be taking vitamin D as a serious sort of response to this topic, isn't it? But I bet the NHS aren't funding that.
But even in hot countries, like Singapore, like China, this is a problem. And there are efforts going on in these countries to address it. Like Singapore, they're having longer school playtimes. Their lessons are being deliberately timetabled so that kids have to walk further between classes. In China, they tried glass classrooms, which not surprisingly didn't go down too well because it just boiled everyone to death.
Yeah.
But in Singapore, they're also trialling a smartwatch that tracks the minute of exposure to good quality light as well as activity. So clearly this is a problem and people do feel that this needs to be addressed, whether it's through changing urban planning, through more awareness campaigns.
Do any of you ever go and work outside? I mean, we're sitting in a room, I should say now, with no windows at all.
No.
Because you could, couldn't you? You could, I mean, is there a roof terrace here? There isn't, is there? There's a garden downstairs.
Yeah, there's the outside bit.
It's on the street. But
Wi-Fi
you could,
goes dodgy though, doesn't it?
But you could sit with a laptop and do some work, couldn't you?
You could,
And you don't.
No,
Hypocrites.
we need to. Or just take more pills.
Yeah, sure,
more
that's
pills.
the solution. Okay, fine. Kari, you're up next after this. Kari, your turn. What do you think this week will be remembered for?
I think we're asking, hey kids, do you want to help kill a terrorist?
From games that let you play a pretend spy mission to a wheel that decides how your mission went, there's something for everyone in the new International Spy Museum. It's twice as big as the old one. Filling it with artifacts was no small task.
How do you get them, right? How do you actually find things that are secret? Because the best intelligence operations we may never know about.
But we do know about these: the invisible ink, the rocks for making dead drops, and you gotta love the disguises.
That was News 4's Amy Cho speaking on Tuesday at the relaunch of the International Spy Museum in Washington. Kari, it all sounds tremendous fun. Is this your recommendation to take the kids over half term?
It does sound very good fun, actually, but with reservations. There has been a Twitter spat, actually, about this. There's a display on the US use of torture in the wake of the 9/11 attacks that critics say sanitizes the punishments, and defense lawyers from the military who are representing the 5 men accused of the 9/11 attacks being held at Guantanamo Bay. They're currently undergoing military tribunal trials. They visited this museum last week at the invitation of the chief historian at the museum, and they were not happy with what they found.
And that in itself, that visit, was the result of this Twitter spat that you
Yes.
referenced. So what happened on Twitter?
So basically, people who've been to the museum are criticising this display. It begins with giant yellow letters on the wall asking, what is torture? And then there are all sorts of written explanations which are apparently aimed at providing a balanced account. One asks, for example, does enhanced interrogation work? And another answers, many are confident that strong methods are effective. Others, including experienced interrogators, psychologists and people who've endured such techniques, believe that less severe forms of questioning yield better results.
Jamie, is that not a fair depiction of the debate?
No.
Why?
I just think it's exactly like climate change. And if you are saying that, as the exhibit says, that some people think this, but a lot of experts and everyone else thinks the other thing, to provide it as a fair and balanced argument when the weight of the argument is about 90-10 in terms of people thinking that torture is not an effective use, it's despicable, really, if I'm honest. If you've got kids going there looking and going, oh, actually, maybe torture is effective. And yes, like I imagine what you're about to say is that as the majority of Americans believe that actually torture could be quite a good thing if it stops people bombing, then actually maybe that should be reflected in a museum. But I just don't think it should.
But I think also less severe forms of questioning yield better results. It's very weak wording, isn't it? It's not exactly, a full-throated denunciation of these methods. And I think that's what a lot of people are complaining about. There's a computer game, effectively a computer game with a giant screen on a wall called The Hunt for Osama bin Laden, and you see icons representing bin Laden's courier and the Al-Qaeda leadership, and visitors can basically sit at screens and sort of say where they think the figure should go. And there's a voiceover saying, remember, the president is deciding to go ahead with a raid. We need to show him our results. So even though it's claiming to be providing a balanced view, it's certainly not very negative in its portrayal of torture. It's more of just it's not nice, but, these are terrorists.
But actually, isn't that the case with sort of any museum that deals with war, really? I mean, I took my kid to the RAF museum in Colindale a few weeks ago, and it was great, by the way. If you're listening and you have a 3-year-old who likes planes, it was brilliant. He saw lots of planes. They have lots of displays for children, and he got to climb in planes. But I mean, I would say it glorifies war. There's a little bit about the fact that these young men who were sent to their death in these planes didn't have a nice time all the time. But basically, it's about, look how wonderful the machinery is, which of course is only part of the discussion. That's the case with any kind of nationally funded museum about those kinds of issues.
And I think, you look at the museums like the London Dungeon, or there's plenty of these kind of dungeon-style museums across the UK and around the world that explicitly have torture implements in them as a sort of fun, titillating, entertaining kind of a thing that people are meant to enjoy in some way. And I think people do get some kind of perverse thrill out of seeing the implements of torture.
Yeah, I just think there's a better way of doing it. I think that it's
which would be
interesting.
what? You'd still have a display showing what waterboarding is in the Spy Museum. That's legit.
Yeah.
It's just you'd frame it as, here's a shameful chapter from our recent history.
Have you been to any of the museums in Berlin? So there are a number of very fascinating museums where the Germans have done a very good expose on Nazis and the Holocaust and things.
Basically, international agreement that the Nazis were the bad guys, isn't there?
I think there's basically international agreement that torture is wrong.
But there aren't amongst the American public, which is exactly what you were saying earlier. So hold on. You're right, of course, that it asked the specific question: was it wrong for the US military to use torture, armed with the kind of background information that you'd like them to have? Probably most Americans would agree that that was a mistake, but they're not going to say it was wrong to use everything we had in the war in Iraq and Afghanistan, because that's not what they believe. But it's difficult at the moment, isn't it, to present that and not acknowledge it.
But you could frame it in a way that, as you said, gives Americans the opinion that while this took place, it wasn't for the right reasons and it wasn't done legally.
Framing is the big question here. And you look at the other places that people are exposed to torture in the world of infotainment, and Hollywood's depiction of the way that the US particularly used torture, especially in the war on terror, it kind of is problematic, and you can see how there's a through line between those depictions and people's viewpoints. I think that that's the same with the museum.
I think that's the point that these lawyers are making. The fact is that at the end of this exhibit, that's supposed to provide a balanced view, and perhaps we're just coming at this from a very leftist, point of view, but I cannot believe that anyone thinks torture is okay. And yet, at the end of the exhibit, visitors are asked, would you be willing to have the US torture suspected terrorists if they may know details about future attacks? And in the first 2 weeks of this exhibit, 59% of visitors pressed the yes button. You've got the...
But President Trump has pressed the yes button. I mean, that's the point.
Well, he hasn't. It's illegal still under US law.
Yeah, but he said that he supports it. So that it is a legitimate debate in US politics. The fact that you disagree with it doesn't mean that the debate isn't happening.
Well, torture's been outlawed internationally since 1948. 1984, 156 nations signed the UN Convention Against Torture. So it is illegal. Whatever, Trump might be saying, I think it works, I think we should bring it back. The point is, this is an illegal thing under US law, and there's an exhibition in Washington where visitors are saying, yeah, I think it's okay.
And
that's pretty astounding.
There's a broader question as well, which I think everyone, in the world, you could look back on a lot of our podcast, and I think we probably touch on it, is this idea of where morals and safety and national security intersect. Theresa May has countless times talked about Saudi Arabia as being our friends and allies and protecting our civilians and not worrying. This, unfortunately, the fact that they kill people and have huge human rights abuses, unfortunately, while we don't do it or condone it, we still want to be friends with them because they protect us. And people do really believe that in this country and in America, or probably across the West. People would say, yes, it's unfortunately, if we want to keep people safe, we do have to do these bad things.
It's interesting. The 2012 film Zero Dark 30, the Pakistani 9/11 suspect Ammar al-Baluchi was seen being waterboarded, and it suggested that he gave up information that led to bin Laden as a result. But in fact, a 2014 Senate inquiry into torture concluded that it had led to no life-saving intelligence whatsoever. And in fact, there's never been any documented case in the US, at least, of torture leading to life-saving intelligence. And this is what's sort of being glossed over. I think that a lot of people aren't aware. It's sort of, we have to do this to protect ourselves. Experts worldwide are saying it doesn't work.
And that's kind of the problem with asking a moral question when the fundamental information at the heart of it is incorrect. If you ask people, is it worth doing X as a utilitarian means to getting Y result, it's fair enough if those things connect. But if they don't actually connect, then it's just a fallacy.
This new display, it does actually have impact on something that's going on at the moment, the trial of these 5 Guantanamo Bay detainees. They've been undergoing pre-trial hearings for 7 years because, and basically the central point of contention which is causing these delays is whether statements that they made after being tortured have any validity. It's not just that, torture is bad, it's certainly in my opinion, it's the fact that it's messing up the law because...
Well, how? A court judge isn't going to say, well, I've been thinking about whether or not you should have been tortured for 6 years, but I've made my mind up after visiting the Spy Museum.
What I'm saying is that this Spy Museum is advocating, or certainly not
legitimising the
debate.
Well, I think we're all agreed on that, but I'm just saying that is a debate that's happening.
But sure.
I mean, that is what the judge is deciding, isn't it?
Yes, agreed. But the point is that I think this in itself is an example that, given that information gleaned from torture, if it can't be used in court, then surely that in itself is proof that it's not. It's been illegal under US law to sort of formally outlawed in 2015 to use torture.
I mean, it's hard to imagine any exhibit on the wars of the last 20 years that wouldn't have this kind of controversy. And isn't that the case really in the recent shadow of any war throughout history? It's easier to commemorate things and talk about them 50 years afterwards when everyone's dead.
Some of the most interesting museums that I've been to, I think of one in Sarajevo in Bosnia about the siege. And actually the closeness to the event means that the ability of people to recount and bring it to life more vividly is actually so much more impressive. From a hoping to gain an educational standpoint, that museum about the siege in Sarajevo, when I was there, it deeply affected me. And part of that is the closeness to the event. And so perhaps we need to learn that from things like this spy museum and things like that actually by involving the people involved and the closeness to it, we can have a kind of deeper effect on people.
Okay, I'm going to latch on to the fact that you're in serious mode, Jamie, and invite you to offer your story after this. And so finally this week, it's Jamie. What do you think this week will be remembered for?
This was the week we finally learned that all PR really is good PR.
The tragedy of all of this is the Liberal Democrats had made the arguments for proportional representation for about 40 years. When Clegg got the opportunity, he went for a referendum on AV, which wasn't actually proportional, it was preferential, which nobody understood, and you couldn't explain in a sentence, and that's why the referendum was lost. That was a disaster, one of the worst decisions of Clegg's career.
Nigel Farage there, speaking back in 2015 when the Brexit Party was merely a twinkle in his eye. Jamie, what do you want to talk about today? PR, proportional representation.
That's right, proportional representation. This week there was some elections.
I noticed.
They were, very consequential, but that's not the point of this podcast, I've learned after all this time. But I do think that this was probably the turning point. We will look back on this election as being the turning point. The Brexit Party won by quite a considerable amount, but we were voting using the D'Hondt method rather than first past the post. Quick summary of the difference, really. One means that the number of votes that a party gets is equal to the amount of power they get. The other is the system that we currently hold and is
for our national elections,
elections, and is corrupt and unfair. I think would be a good way of describing it.
So this is your balanced description if you were curating the Museum of Parliamentary Democracy.
Yeah. There'd be a big sign here saying reasons that FTPP is corrupt.
For international listeners, the system that we use, and very few other countries do still use, is electing a constituency member of Parliament. So the person or the party with the most votes in an area goes on to win that area. But that could mean that you end up being the Member of Parliament despite having polled very few.
Yes. I think what's interesting when we look at what could possibly happen in the next election is that the Conservatives will go into the election saying that any vote for the Brexit Party is going to be wasted because the Conservatives are the only ones that can truly stop Jeremy Corbyn getting into power. And then you've got the Labour saying that any potential Green voters or even Lib Dems, if you voted for the Lib Dems or the Greens, would let the Tories into power and that their vote would then be wasted. Unfortunately, with the system as we have it currently, they are actually correct in that regard. So, in order to win anywhere near the fair share of your votes, you would need to have an almost incredible swing. The Brexit Party would need to have, I think, if they were to repeat the results that they had this time around, they would maybe get 15 seats in the House of Commons, despite winning 39% of the vote. That's, obviously, if people voted in the same ways and all of that stuff. I think this was the week that people really did see how unfair our system was. A lot of the problems that people have with changing to proportional representation is around the idea that perhaps proportional representation is too complicated, but we've managed to do it this time, and indeed people have managed to vote for the way in which they wanted to.
Yeah. Although when you say we've managed to do it this time, and we've managed to do it this time and elected a party that wants us to leave the European Parliament, which would mean an end to proportional representation in this country, and they're the party that won.
Yes.
So, I mean, it's not a resounding vote for PR, is it?
Well, but they are... Nigel Farage is a supporter of proportional representation, so they do want it.
Yeah. Kari, your views. Is this debate gathering pace?
Yeah, I think definitely, as Jamie says, the next general election, Britain's voters may have to choose between half a dozen or more credible political parties, because politics is splintering as a result of Brexit. So it's the current first past the post system is just going to be unsustainable. And it has been for a long time. It was invented in the 12th century. It was invented for a whole different model of democracy that no longer applies. I think it's just frankly amazing that it's lasted this long.
But you do lose your constituency MP if you move to proportional representation. That is a problem, isn't it? People like the idea that the person they see on telly is the person that they can go and canvass. So what would you... how would it work?
So there's the ones that we use for the London Assembly and for the Scottish National Parliament is that it's called parallel voting. But you would vote twice. So you'd vote once for your constituency MP, for someone that's local, and then you would also vote for the party that you wanted to govern. And so the way that would work is that all of the people who got the most votes in each constituency would then win, but then there'd be the same again for the party that wanted to govern, and it would be done on a ratio so that the people with the most constituencies, they'd still have the same amount of power. So you would have two sets of MPs, one local MP who was for your constituency, but then also within the Parliament there would be ones for the party itself, so you'd be able to choose both.
It's the way that the New Zealand electoral system works, in fact, and they have switched to that comparatively recently, in fact, and it sort of seems like a best of both worlds option in a way.
So you still have first past the post, in effect, on your constituency MP?
Yes. So
don't you just have twice as many MPs then?
So you would have a situation where you take all 650 constituencies that now exist, 650 seats, you divide that in half, and you say, so like half of them would have MPs, you maybe just, it would involve redrawing the boundaries a bit in order to make the constituencies a bit larger, in order to be able to have all of the same. So you could keep the same number of MPs in Parliament. You wouldn't have to have 1,300 or whatever.
But isn't the point about floating voters, because that's what happens, is the two main parties in this country, as in the United States, try and woo the floating voters to come and vote for them. And the way they do that, usually, I know there are exceptions, Trump, but usually what they try and do is they put out centrist policies, because you're more likely, for example, to switch to the Democrats if you're a Republican, if the Democrats move slightly right, and vice versa. So the argument is that creates centrist politics. Isn't that usually true?
Yes, and also...
Whereas otherwise the party's entrenched, don't they? And they could both become sort of our version of the Tea Party and Corbynistas.
You do have a certain amount of that shuffling towards the middle ground come election time in both major parties, so that they can win power and then they can veer off towards their actual ideological bent after they have power, and then sort of turn back towards the middle come the next election. But I suppose the other thing that historically advocates for a two-party system that comes about via first past the post tend to say what you can do with a two-party system is continue to have the parties shift in their own internal ideologies by people who have different views entering those parties and shifting them, so both here and in Australia, and, in most places that have a two-party system, you have a further left group and a further right group in both major parties. And whoever is in the ascendant depends on how much the arguments that the people within that group are making get to determine party policy. And so it's still possible, people say, who are advocates for first past the post, to have proper representation going on as long as parties are continuing to listen to the views of the people in the same way that smaller parties might in proportional representation.
Now, though, and why I think this week is the real turning point, is that we've now entered a situation that you were just describing there, where a Boris Johnson-led Conservative Party that is pro-no deal is that entrenched position up against a Corbynista-led Labour Party that is also entrenched on the left. So we have FPTV, but we also now have the system that first past the post is meant to avoid. So why not just change it?
And the argument goes that you then have more coalitions, that's what we'd end up with. And then that leads to consensus anyway, even if each individual party is very entrenched in their position. Critics worry that it'll give voice to extremists, though, Kari, proportional representation.
I think at the moment those extremists do have a voice, and they've almost been able to feed off the fact that, we have no representation in Parliament, we're the underdog, and they can basically say what they like. I'd say put them in Parliament, make them accountable for their actions, and that will actually undermine their arguments more than just standing off to the sides where they don't have to prove anything because it's all theoretical. And frankly, also, much as I hate the fact that, if in the 2015 election, if we'd had proportional representation, UKIP would have been the third largest party with 81 seats instead of 1. I hate that, but that's democracy. That's free speech.
Well, would that have ended up in it's hard to imagine a worse situation around Brexit at the moment, but would that have made things better, having UKIP have 81 seats now?
I'm not sure. It's all what ifs, isn't it? But I think what's interesting is when you look at UKIP within, admittedly the European Parliament is somewhere they don't agree with, so it's unlikely they're going to work towards it. But the number of reports or actual days that they have taken up time in Brussels as MEPs is shocking in comparison to some of the other parties. And so I think Kari's right, is that if we put them in power, if we put them on select committee hearings, if you put those people in charge of things, and maybe things start to fall apart, or maybe things start to work better. But if you put them into power and show them how democracy is meant to work, or the system is meant to work, then it at least gives people a way. At the moment, Nigel Farage and the Brexit Party are able to be everything to everyone. Saying that you don't want a manifesto, that you're not going to have a manifesto. You're able to appeal to everyone while also not being pinned down on anything at all. And maybe actually getting them in charge, having them in a coalition would be a way to solve it.
That's the thing. You can't fail if you don't have a chance to succeed. Give them a chance and let's see how they do then. And then maybe we'll get a different, within a few years, maybe public opinion will have shifted. But at the moment, it's just entrenched because people are angry. Even in the last government returned with a substantial majority was Labour in 2005, and they only gained 36% of the popular vote. All we're doing is pushing people to extremes because they're saying, okay, well, even the last, majority government only represented a third of this country. So yes, of course, people are going to veer off to the other sides and come up with increasingly extreme opinions.
But the British public don't seem to be that in favour of voting for reforming things, do they?
No.
We still have the House of Lords, we still have the monarchy. The last big referendum about this, as Nigel Farage said in his clip, was lost and people preferred first past the post. Then the other big referendum we had was Brexit, and a lot of people are just feeling regret they were ever asked the question.
I do think
is this ever going to change?
I do think Brexit's had a major effect. A poll last summer found that only 14% of the British public oppose switching to proportional representation. So I think, as Jamie said, Brexit has had a huge effect on people's attitudes to this.
The thing about the referendums and your question of, are people willing to reform or change after all of the referendums is really interesting, because the 2011 referendum on AV and the proportional representation, the fact that they were able to win that so easily was part of the reason that they went in for the 2016 referendum, because they thought that they could pull all of the same stunts, all of the same tricks, and they've actually left us in a much worse position now. So I think you might be right, Ollie.
Well, I'll take that. That is it from this edition of The Week Unwrapped. My thanks to Jamie Timson, Kari, Wilkin and Arion McNicoll. Make The Week Unwrapped your first choice when you subscribe on your podcast app of choice. We're unrepresentative of most current affairs podcasts in that we're usually pretty good at not mentioning Brexit. It did slip through the net a few times this week. I've been Olly Mann. Our music is by Tom Morby, the producer Matt Hill at Rethink Audio. Until we meet again to unwrap next week, bye-bye.